The first time my brother called me selfish, it was at my parents' Christmas dinner, and no one corrected him. No more. That silence told me everything I needed to know, even if I didn't understand it yet. My name is Natalie Pierce. I was 34 that winter, old enough to recognize patterns, young enough to still believe love would eventually outweigh them. We were seated around my parents' long dining table in their Connecticut colonial, the one my father never stopped calling the house I built, even though my mother paid half the mortgage and my grandmother had fronted the down payment decades earlier. Christmas dinner had always followed the same script. My mother, Linda, overcooked the turkey. My father, Robert, poured wine too generously. My younger brother, Ethan, dominated the conversation. I listened. I smiled. I helped clean up. That was my role. This year felt no different until it suddenly did. We were halfway through dessert when my father raised his glass and said, "There's something we want to share as a family." I remember the way my fork froze midair. Announcements at our table were never good news for me. Ethan leaned back in his chair, already smiling like he knew what was coming. His wife, Marissa, squeezed his arm. My mother glanced at me briefly, then away. "We've updated our will," my father said. Nothing dramatic, just practical planning. I nodded slowly. Practical was another word my parents used when they'd already made up their minds. "The business will transition fully to Ethan," my father continued. "He's been preparing for it for years." That part wasn't new. Pierce Industrial Supply had been positioned as Ethan's future since we were kids. What was new was the sentence that followed. "And Natalie," my mother added quickly, "you'll receive a cash settlement instead. It's cleaner that way." Cleaner for whom I wondered, but I didn't ask. Not yet. How much? Ethan asked casually, as if discussing a rebate. My father named a number. It sounded generous if you didn't know the books. If you hadn't spent nights balancing accounts, negotiating contracts, quietly fixing problems so the company didn't implode during the recession. If you hadn't been the one who came back home at 26 to help temporarily while Ethan explored his options. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not pain, exactly, more like recognition. "That doesn't reflect her contributions," my grandmother, Ruth, said from the end of the table. Her voice was thin but steady. My father cleared his throat. "Mom, we've considered everything." Ethan laughed softly. "Nat doesn't even want the business. She's always talking about work-life balance." I looked at him then. Really looked. He didn't meet my eyes. "That's not what I said," I replied. He shrugged. "You always take things personally." And then he said it. "Honestly, you're being selfish." The word landed hard, sharp enough that I expected someone to object, to say that wasn't fair, to remind him who had kept the company afloat when he walked away for 3 years, to chase a startup that failed. No one spoke. My mother stared at her plate. My father sipped his wine. Marissa avoided my gaze. The silence wrapped around the word selfish and sealed it in place. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I finished my coffee, excused myself politely, and helped clear the dishes like I always did. But something inside me shifted. Later that night, as I stood alone in my childhood bedroom, staring at the same pale blue walls, my phone buzzed with a text from Marissa. "Don't take it the wrong way. This is just easier for everyone." Easier. That word again. I drove back to my apartment in New Haven that night instead of staying over. The highway was empty, the radio low. I kept replaying the moment at the table, the way the accusation had hung there, unanswered. I told myself it was about inheritance, about money, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was about exclusion. Over the next few weeks, the pattern revealed itself slowly, the way control always does. Small changes framed as logistics. My access to company accounts was reduced. Invitations to strategy meetings stopped arriving. Ethan began signing emails as president, even though nothing had been finalized. When I asked my father about it, he said, "We're just easing into things." When I asked my mother, she said, "You know how sensitive Ethan is." Sensitive, another word that never applied to me. In January, my birthday passed with a text from my parents and nothing else. No dinner, no call. Ethan posted photos that night from a ski trip in Vermont, captioned "Family Time." I didn't comment. The final straw didn't come with a fight. It came with an email. Subject line: transition plan, final draft. Attached was a document outlining the formal restructuring of Pierce Industrial Supply. Ethan as sole managing director. Marissa as operations lead. My role redefined as external consultant, 6-month term renewable, at the company's discretion. At the bottom, a note from my father. "We need this signed by Friday so we can move forward." Move forward without me. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, the document open on my laptop, the cursor blinking like it was waiting for permission. This was the moment everything clarified. Love, I realized, had never been unconditional here. It was compliance, dressed up as concern. Contribution accepted, as long as it didn't threaten the hierarchy. Silence rewarded. Resistance punished quietly. I didn't call my parents. I didn't confront Ethan. I didn't reply to the email. Instead, I opened a new tab and searched for a lawyer. Her name was Denise Calder. Estate law, corporate transitions, family disputes. Her office was 20 minutes away. When she answered the phone, I didn't overshare. I didn't dramatize. "I need someone to review a will update in a business restructuring," I said. "I believe I'm being excluded." There was a brief pause. "When can you come in?" "Tomorrow," I replied. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because I felt safe, but because I finally stopped pretending I was. What I didn't know yet was that Christmas dinner hadn't been the beginning. It had been the warning. And by the time they realized I wasn't going to quietly disappear, the tables would already be turning. Denise Calder's office was smaller than I expected. No sweeping views, no dramatic wood paneling, just clean lines, a wide desk, and a woman in her early 60s who listened without interrupting. That alone felt unfamiliar. I laid out the facts: the Christmas announcement, the will update, the transition plan. I kept my tone, even almost clinical. I didn't talk about feelings. I talked about timelines, documents, contributions. Denise nodded occasionally, making notes, letting the silence do its work. When I finished, she leaned back slightly and folded her hands. "You weren't excluded accidentally," she said. I didn't react. I'd already reached that conclusion on my own. "This was a coordinated shift," she continued. "Financially and legally. They assumed you would sign, because you always have." That stung more than I expected. Not because it was untrue, but because it was precise. "Do I have options?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "But not if you keep acting like this is a family disagreement." "It's not. It's a business decision with legal consequences." I nodded slowly. She pulled a file from her drawer. "Let's start with your grandmother." I looked up. "Ruth, yes. You mentioned she contributed to the original purchase of the house and early business capital." "She did," I said. "She never let my father forget it." Denise smiled faintly. "Good, because that gives us leverage. Also, I want to see any documentation tied to your role in the company. Emails, contracts, anything that shows reliance." "I have those," I said. "I kept everything." That was the first time her expression changed. "Of course you did." When I left her office, the air felt different. Not lighter, sharper, like I'd stepped into focus. At work, nothing had officially changed yet, but the atmosphere had. Ethan moved through the building, like it already belonged to him. He stopped including me on decisions I'd handled for years. When I raised concerns, he smiled and said, "Let's not complicate things right now." Complicate, another word that meant stop talking. One afternoon, Marissa cornered me by the coffee machine. "You don't seem happy," she said too brightly. "I'm fine," I replied. She tilted her head. "You know Ethan's under a lot of pressure. This transition isn't easy for him." I looked at her. "Transitions rarely are." She laughed lightly, as if I'd made a joke. "We just don't want any drama." There it was. That night, I visited my grandmother. Ruth lived in a smaller house now closer to town. She moved slowly, but her mind was sharp, her eyes observant. "You look thinner," she said as I kissed her cheek. "So do you," I replied. We sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around mugs of tea. "They told me," she said, without prompting, "about the will, about the company." And I asked. She snorted softly. "Your father thinks if he calls something practical enough times, it becomes fair." I smiled despite myself. "They didn't expect you to object," she continued. "They never do." "I didn't object," I said. "I just didn't agree." Her eyes met mine. "Good." She stood carefully and walked to a cabinet, pulling out a folder. Inside were old documents, deeds, notes, a handwritten ledger from decades earlier. "I kept copies," she said, "because men forget. Women remember." I swallowed hard. "Your grandfather always said the business survived because of adaptability," she added, "not entitlement." I left with copies of everything. The next escalation came quietly. My access to the company's financial software was revoked without notice. When I asked IT, they said the request came directly from Ethan. I emailed my father. No response. I emailed again, attaching the transition plan and asking for clarification on my role. This time, he replied, short, "We'll discuss soon." Soon never came. Instead, Denise called me 2 days later. "They've filed the updated will," she said, "and they didn't disclose your grandmother's contribution." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means the document is vulnerable," she said, "but only if challenged." I closed my eyes briefly. "Also," she continued, "the restructuring agreement reclassifies your past work as salaried labor only. No equity, no deferred compensation." I laughed once quietly. "That's bold." "Yes," Denise agreed. "And risky." At dinner that night, alone in my apartment, I realized something unsettling. They weren't just pushing me out. They were rewriting the story. The narrative now was that Ethan had carried the company, that I'd helped, but only because I was asked, that my contributions were generous gestures, not foundational work. If that version solidified, it wouldn't just affect money. It would affect truth. I stopped eating and opened my laptop. I forwarded every relevant document to Denise. Every email, every contract, every late-night message, where someone had thanked me for saving a deal or fixing a mistake. I didn't annotate. I didn't editorialize. Facts didn't need commentary. The next morning, my father showed up at my apartment unannounced. He looked uncomfortable, like someone stepping into unfamiliar territory. "This isn't how we wanted this to go," he said. "How did you want it to go?" I asked. "You sign, we move on." I nodded. "Without me." He frowned. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "No," I said evenly. "I'm making it accurate." He sighed. "You always were difficult when things didn't go your way." I met his eyes. "You mean when I didn't disappear?" He didn't answer that. When he left, I didn't feel shaken. I felt resolved. That evening, Denise sent the draft of a formal response. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't emotional. It was precise. A notice preserving my rights. A request for full disclosure. A statement of interest in the business and estate based on documented contributions. I read it twice. Then I signed. As I clicked send, something settled in me. This wasn't revenge. Not yet. It was the moment I stopped asking for a seat and started claiming what had always been mine. And they still had no idea how much that would cost them. The response from my family didn't come as anger. It came as silence. Days passed, then a week. No calls, no emails, no acknowledgement of Denise's letter. It was as if I'd stopped existing, and in a way that was familiar. Growing up, silence had always been their favorite tool. Not punishment, correction. At work, the shift became undeniable. My office was reassigned while I was at lunch. When I came back, my nameplate was gone. My things were stacked neatly in a box by reception, like someone had cleaned up after a guest who overstayed. Ethan didn't look up when I passed his door. Marissa did. She gave me a look that was almost sympathetic, which somehow felt worse. I didn't say anything. I carried the box to my car and drove home in the middle of the workday. No scene, no goodbye email, just removal. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "Your father is very upset. This didn't have to turn into a confrontation." I stared at the word confrontation for a long time. There hadn't been one. No raised voices, no accusations, just paperwork and boundaries. If that felt like confrontation to them, it was because they'd never expected resistance to be quiet. I didn't reply. Instead, I called Denise. "They've cut me off completely," I said. "Work, communication, everything." Her voice stayed calm. "Good, good," I repeated. "Yes," she said. "It means they're reacting emotionally, and emotional reactions lead to mistakes." The first mistake came faster than I expected. 2 days later, my grandmother Ruth called me late in the evening. "They came by today," she said. "Your parents. Ethan, too." My stomach tightened. "What did they want?" "They wanted me to sign something," she replied. "A statement saying I gifted the startup money to your father outright. No conditions." And I asked, and I told them no. I exhaled slowly. They were surprised, she continued. "Your father kept saying it was just a formality." "Was Ethan there?" I asked. "Yes." He didn't say much, just watched. That image stayed with me. Ethan watching, letting others do the dirty work. He'd always been good at that. The next morning, Denise forwarded me an email. "Your family's attorney has responded." The message was brief, polite, and dismissive. They denied any wrongdoing, claimed the restructuring was standard, asserted that I had no ownership interest beyond what was being offered. At the bottom was a line that made my jaw tighten. "We trust this matter can be resolved privately, without unnecessary escalation." Unnecessary, as if protecting myself were an inconvenience. Denise called me an hour later. "They're trying to intimidate you into backing down," she said. "But they slipped." How, I asked. "They acknowledged your role in operational continuity," she replied. "That establishes reliance." I leaned back in my chair, letting that sink in. "Also," she added, "they didn't address your grandmother's contributions. At all." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means they're hoping she won't intervene." That afternoon, I met Ruth again. She looked tired, but resolute. "I raised your father better than this," she said quietly. "But power makes people forget who helped them get it." She slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a notarized affidavit outlining her financial involvement in the business, including conditions she'd placed verbally at the time. "I never wrote it down," she said. "I trusted him." I swallowed. "Are you sure you want to do this?" She met my eyes. "I'm sure I want the truth recorded." When I left her house, I felt the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about a family narrative being corrected, whether they liked it or not. The next escalation came through an unexpected channel. A longtime vendor, Paul Hendricks, called me directly. "Natalie," he said, sounding hesitant, "I heard you're no longer with Pierce." "Not officially," I replied. "Why?" "Ethan's renegotiating contracts," he said. "He doesn't understand the margins. He's pushing terms that don't work." I closed my eyes briefly. "He mentioned you," Paul continued. "Said you were no longer involved, but that you'd always been cautious." Cautious. The polite word for thorough. I thanked Paul and hung up. That night, I added another file to the growing folder on my laptop. Timeline. In it, I began documenting every change Ethan made, every risk he introduced, every relationship strained by his overconfidence. Not to interfere, to observe. My mother called the next day. "I don't recognize you," she said, without greeting. "That's because you never looked closely," I replied. She inhaled sharply. "This legal route is extreme." "No," I said calmly. "What's extreme is pretending I don't exist unless I comply." There was a pause. "You've changed," she said. "Yes," I replied. I stopped negotiating my worth. She hung up. I sat there, afterward, phone still in my hand, and felt something unexpected. Relief. The mask was off now. The expectations were exposed. They weren't disappointed in me. They were inconvenienced. That realization hardened something inside me, not into anger, but into clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be talked through. It was a power struggle they thought they'd already won, and they were about to learn what happens when the person you underestimated stops playing along. By early March, the house I grew up in felt farther away than any physical distance could explain. Not because I missed it, because the version of me who had belonged there no longer existed. Denise advised patience. "Let them move first," she said. "People who believe they're untouchable always overplay their hand." She was right. The next move came from the company's bank. I received a formal notice, addressed to me personally, requesting clarification on my authority status, related to 2 outstanding credit instruments. My name was still listed as a guarantor on legacy agreements Ethan had either forgotten or assumed no longer mattered. I forwarded the letter to Denise without comment. She called me 10 minutes later. "This is significant," she said. "If they're restructuring without removing you properly, they've created exposure." "What do we do?" I asked. "We do nothing," she replied. "We let the bank ask questions." The questions came fast. Ethan panicked. He called me for the first time in weeks, his voice tight and controlled, in the way it always was when he felt cornered. "Why is the bank contacting you?" "Because my name is still on the paperwork," I said. "That's a technicality," he snapped. "No," I replied calmly. "It's an obligation." He lowered his voice. "You're trying to sabotage us." I almost laughed. "I haven't touched anything." Silence stretched between us. "You need to step back," he said finally. "You're not part of this anymore." I held the phone loosely in my hand. "Then remove me correctly." He hung up. That afternoon, Denise sent a formal notice to the company's counsel requesting immediate clarification of my legal exposure and indemnification. It was written politely, professionally, and with just enough precision to make it impossible to ignore. The response came the next morning. They wanted to meet, neutral location, no family present, just attorneys. I agreed. The conference room was sterile, the kind designed to make conflict feel procedural. Ethan wasn't there. Neither were my parents. Their lawyer, a man named Harold White, spoke for them. "We believe this can be resolved amicably," he said. "I'm sure you do," Denise replied. Harold slid a revised agreement across the table. It offered a slightly higher cash settlement in exchange for my signature, a full release of claims, and a non-disclosure clause. I scanned it once. "You still haven't addressed my grandmother's contribution," I said. Harold blinked. "That's not relevant to this agreement." "It is to me," I replied. Denise leaned forward. "Also, the bank exposure remains unresolved." Harold frowned. "That's an internal matter?" "No," Denise said calmly. "It's my client's liability." The meeting ended without resolution. 2 days later, my grandmother was hospitalized. Nothing dramatic. A fall. Observation overnight. But the timing was too precise to ignore. My mother called me from the hospital waiting room. "She keeps asking for you," she said. "I'll come," I replied. Not out of obligation, out of choice. Ruth looked small in the hospital bed, but her eyes were sharp when she saw me. "They're scared," she said without preamble. "I know," I replied. "They think if they wait long enough, you'll soften." I shook my head. I won't, she smiled faintly. Good. She asked me to open her bag. Inside was another folder. These are old board notes, she said, from when your father first expanded the business. I was there. I voted. I flipped through them slowly, heart pounding. You were never meant to be invisible, she continued. They just needed you to believe you were. When I left the hospital, Denise was waiting in the lobby. I thought you might need this, she said, handing me a document. It was a motion, not a lawsuit. A formal assertion of interest in the company and estate, citing documented contributions, fiduciary exposure, and misrepresentation. If we file this, she said, things accelerate. I thought about it. About Christmas dinner, about my box by reception, about my name quietly erased. Yes, I said. File it. The reaction was immediate. My parents called that night, both of them on the line, voices overlapping. This is getting out of control, my father said. You're humiliating us, my mother added. I listened without interrupting. You don't understand what you're doing, my father continued. You're tearing the family apart. No, I said calmly. I'm documenting what already happened. There was a long silence. You've always been dramatic, my mother said finally. I exhaled slowly. You've always confused silence with agreement. I hung up. The next week, the board requested a review. Not because of me, because of risk. Ethan's contracts were questioned. Vendor relationships were strained. The bank demanded updated guarantees. And suddenly, my absence mattered. A board member I barely knew called me privately. We didn't realize how much you handled, he said. I wasn't loud about it, I replied. He hesitated. Would you consider advising during the transition? I smiled to myself. I already am. Just not for you. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by folders, timelines, and truth. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was reacting. I was ahead. They still believed this was a negotiation. They didn't understand yet. This wasn't about getting more. It was about taking back authorship of a story they'd edited me out of. And once the record was corrected, nothing would ever go back to the way it was. April began with a letter I didn't expect. In a silence, I did. The letter came from the board of Pierce Industrial Supply, not from my parents, not from Ethan. That alone told me the center of gravity had shifted. When institutions start bypassing family, it means the family has become a liability. The message was formal, a request for a private meeting to discuss governance concerns and historical, operational dependencies. No accusations, no blame, just questions. Denise read it twice before looking up at me. They're realizing they don't actually know how the company runs. I nodded. They never needed to. The meeting was scheduled at a downtown Hartford office, neutral territory, again. This time, there were 5 board members present. Ethan wasn't invited. My parents weren't either. They asked about systems, about vendors, about why certain contracts had been structured the way they were. They asked about risk mitigation during the recession, about a near bankruptcy event in 2014 that I remembered vividly, but had never spoken about publicly. I answered calmly, factually. I didn't embellish. I didn't editorialize. When one of them asked, why wasn't any of this documented under your name? I replied, because I was told not to worry about titles. The room went quiet. After the meeting, one of the board members, a man named Richard Hale, walked with me to the elevator. I owe you an apology, he said, for what I asked, for not asking sooner. I didn't respond. Apologies that come after damage are acknowledgments, not repairs. That afternoon, Ethan emailed me. Not a call, not a confrontation, an email. Subject: we need to resolve this. The body was short. You're putting the company at risk. Let's talk like adults. I forwarded it to Denise. Her reply was immediate. Do not respond. Instead, she sent a counter notice to the company's counsel, attaching Ruth's affidavit, the board notes, and a timeline of my documented contributions. It ended with a simple sentence. My client is prepared to protect her interests fully. 2 days later, the bank escalated. They issued a conditional freeze on a line of credit pending clarification of guarantor obligations. It wasn't catastrophic yet, but it was public enough to rattle confidence. Ethan finally lost his composure. He showed up at my apartment unannounced that evening. "You did this," he said, the moment I opened the door. "No," I replied evenly. "You did." He paced my living room like a caged animal. "You could have just taken the money and left." "I tried to," I said. "You wouldn't let me leave cleanly." "You're punishing us," he snapped. I looked at him, really looked. The entitlement, the panic, the disbelief that consequences were real. "I'm not punishing you," I said. "I stopped protecting you." He stopped pacing. "What do you want?" I thought about the question carefully. "I want my name removed from any liability I don't control," I said. "I want acknowledgement of my equity interest, and I want a clean separation." "That's not happening," he said. I nodded. "Then neither is your peace." He left without another word. The next escalation came from my mother. She invited me to lunch, just the two of us, a neutral cafe we used to go to when I was younger. She looked tired, smaller. The confidence she used to wear so easily was frayed. "This is destroying your father," she said quietly. "I didn't build his identity around excluding me," I replied. She reached across the table, touching my hand. "We thought you'd be okay." That sentence again. I gently pulled my hand away. "That's the problem." She swallowed. "Ethan needs this company." "No," I said. "He wants it." There was a long pause. "You're choosing money over family," she said finally. I took my head. "I'm choosing truth over convenience." She didn't argue after that. That week, Denise filed the next motion. Not a lawsuit, a petition for declaratory judgment regarding ownership interest and guarantor obligations. It forced the issue into the open, forced documentation, forced accountability. The board responded within days. They suspended the transition plan. They hired an external auditor. And for the first time, Ethan was no longer in control of the narrative. Ruth called me that night, her voice soft but steady. "You did the right thing." "I didn't want it to go this far," I said. She chuckled quietly. "Truth always feels far when people have been hiding it." I hung up and sat alone, staring at the city lights outside my window. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. For years, my power had been invisible because it was quiet, because I used it to stabilize, not dominate. Now that I'd withdrawn it, everything was wobbling, and they were finally beginning to understand something I'd known for a long time. The company didn't run because Ethan inherited it. It ran because I held it together. And once that reality was documented, signed, and acknowledged, the balance of power would never return to its old shape. The next move wouldn't be emotional. It would be structural. And that was the kind of revenge that lasts. May arrived with a kind of tension that didn't buzz or crackle. It settled. The auditor's presence changed everything. Meetings slowed. Decisions were deferred. Emails were copied, then copied again. People who had once spoken freely now measured every word. When systems built on assumption are forced into transparency, the discomfort is immediate. I stayed out of it publicly. That was important. Denise had warned me early on. The moment you look eager, they'll paint this as ambition. Let the facts speak. You just exist. So I existed. I went to work at a small consulting firm Denise had connected me with months earlier. Temporary contract, 6 months. Clean boundaries, no family history, no emotional residue. I walked into rooms where no one knew my last name and felt something close to relief. Then the auditor called me directly. His name was Malcolm Reed. Late 40s, careful voice, no wasted words. "I've been reviewing operational records from 2012 to 2019, he said. "Your name appears frequently." "That doesn't surprise me," I replied. What does surprise me, he continued, is how little formal authority you were given relative to your responsibility. I smiled faintly. That was by design. There was a pause. I'd like to speak with you in person. We met at his office 2 days later. He asked about specific decisions, crisis points, why certain vendors had been protected despite short-term losses, why cash had been moved quietly to cover payroll during a downturn no one publicly acknowledged. I answered everything calmly. I wasn't trying to be a hero, I said at one point. I was trying to keep people employed. He nodded. That's not how your role was described internally. No, I said. It wouldn't have served them. By the time I left, I knew the audit wouldn't be kind. The fallout came faster than anyone expected. The bank extended the credit freeze. Not permanent, but conditional. The kind of condition that makes boards sweat. Ethan was stripped of signing authority pending review. That detail came to me secondhand, through a former colleague who still texted occasionally. He didn't sound triumphant. He sounded stunned. They're asking where all the institutional knowledge went, he said. I didn't reply. My parents tried again. This time, they came together. They showed up at Denise's office, unannounced, asking to speak with her directly. She declined. Instead, she sent them a written response, reiterating my position and advising all communication go through counsel. My father left a voicemail that night. You've made your point, he said. This has gone far enough. I listened to it once, then I deleted it. In early June, the board convened an emergency session. They invited me, not as family, as witness. Denise advised me to attend. Say very little, she said. Answer what's asked, nothing more. The boardroom looked different without my parents at the head of the table, without Ethan filling the space with confidence that had never been tested. Richard Hale spoke first. We need clarity, he said, and we need to understand whether the company can function without further disruption. I nodded. Malcolm summarized his findings. Carefully, methodically, he spoke about undocumented decision-making, about risk absorption handled by someone without authority, about reliance that bordered on negligence. Then he said my name. The company's operational continuity during critical periods depended heavily on Natalie Pierce, he said, without formal recognition or compensation commensurate with that responsibility. Silence followed. A board member asked me, "Why didn't you insist on more formal authority?" I answered honestly, "Because I was told it would complicate things." "And why did you stay?" another asked. I thought about that for a moment. Because I believed loyalty mattered. That was the only emotional statement I made. The meeting ended without resolution, but the direction was clear. The transition plan was officially suspended. An interim management firm was brought in, and the company my father had built was no longer his to steer alone. That night, my mother called. Her voice shook. "They're talking about selling." I didn't respond immediately. "They might sell the distribution arm," she continued. "Your father can't accept it." "I didn't ask for this," I said quietly. "I know," she replied. "But you caused it." I inhaled slowly. "No." I stopped preventing it. She didn't argue. The next development came from Ruth. She asked me to come over on a Sunday afternoon. She looked tired, but peaceful. "I've amended my trust," she said. I froze. "Why?" "Because I don't want this dragged out after I'm gone," she replied. "I've clarified everything." She handed me a copy. It named me as executor. It formalized her original financial involvement. It included a clause triggering asset redistribution if family disputes materially harmed the business. My heart pounded. "Are you sure?" She smiled gently. "I've never been more sure of anything." When I left her house, the weight of what was coming settled fully on me. This wasn't just about correcting a narrative anymore. It was about consequences. The final escalation of the month came quietly. A courier delivered a packet to my apartment. Inside was a formal offer from the company. They wanted to buy out my interest, not the insulting cash settlement from before, a real number. Acknowledgement included. It wasn't generous. It was accurate. Denise read it carefully. "They're trying to contain damage," she said. "Is it fair?" I asked. She nodded. "Yes." I didn't sign it. Not yet. Because for the first time, I wasn't reacting to pressure. I was deciding timing. They thought this offer would end it. They didn't understand something fundamental. Money was never the point. Control was. And I hadn't decided yet how much of it I was willing to give back. June ended without resolution. And for the first time, that worked in my favor. The offer sat on my kitchen counter for days untouched. Not out of indecision, but intention. Denise had been clear. The moment I signed the story would close. Whatever leverage I had left would dissolve into a number on a wire transfer. I wasn't finished yet, not because I wanted revenge in the dramatic sense, but because something still felt unresolved, not legally, but structurally. The people who had benefited most from my silence were still framing themselves as victims of circumstance. That needed to change. The board called again in early July. This time, they asked me to attend as an advisor, not a witness. The shift in language mattered. "We need context," Richard Hale said over the phone. "Not just what happened, but why." I agreed to attend under one condition: no family present. There was a pause. Understood. The meeting was tense, but controlled. Malcolm Reed presented additional findings. This time, he focused on governance failures, concentration of authority, lack of oversight, informal decision-making that blurred personal interest and corporate responsibility. Then the questions turned to culture. "Was favoritism an issue?" a board member asked. I took a breath. "It was normalized," I said. "Not discussed, just assumed." They nodded slowly, as if something unspoken had finally been named. After the meeting, Richard pulled me aside. "We underestimated you," he said. "I know," I replied. He hesitated. "Would you consider a temporary role during the transition?" I shook my head. "I won't re-enter a system that required my erasure to function." He accepted that without argument. That night, Ethan emailed me again. This time, there was no pretense. Subject: "What do you want?" The message was longer than before. Defensive. Exhausted. He blamed advisors. Timing. Stress. He said he never meant to push me out, only to simplify things. He said the company was his responsibility now, and that I was making it harder than it needed to be. I read it once, then I closed my laptop. I didn't respond. The next escalation came through my mother. She showed up at my apartment unannounced on a Saturday morning. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not fragile, just worn down by the loss of control. "I don't understand you anymore," she said, as soon as I opened the door. "I know," I replied. She stepped inside, looking around like she was seeing my life for the first time. No family photos, no inherited furniture, no artifacts of obligation. "They're saying you're trying to destroy the company," she said. "I'm not," I replied calmly. "I'm letting it be examined." She shook her head. "Families don't do this to each other." "Families don't erase each other either," I said. She sat down heavily. "You've always been so capable. We thought you'd adapt." That word again. "I did adapt," I said. "I adapted myself out of the picture so things would stay comfortable." She looked at me, then really looked. And for a moment, something flickered in her expression. Recognition, or maybe fear. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. I didn't soften my answer. "That depends on how honest everyone is willing to be." She left shortly after. No hug, no argument, just resignation. Mid-July brought the hearing, not a trial, a procedural review prompted by the declaratory judgment Denise had filed. It forced the court to examine the structure of the buyout, offer the validity of the will changes, and the exposure created by informal guarantor arrangements. I sat beside Denise, hands folded, listening, as the judge asked careful, methodical questions. When my family's attorney tried to frame the dispute as a sibling disagreement, the judge corrected him. "This appears to be a governance issue," she said, "not a personal one." That sentence mattered. The court ordered mediation under judicial oversight and required revised disclosures. It wasn't a ruling in my favor. It was worse for them. It meant transparency. Afterward, Denise turned to me. "You're doing well," she said. "I'm just not interfering," I replied. The mediation was scheduled for August. In the meantime, something unexpected happened. A competitor reached out, not formally, through a former vendor who knew my work. "They're expanding," he said. "They want someone who understands operations without ego." I met with them quietly. No promises, no commitments, just possibility. That possibility did something important. It reminded me that my future wasn't tied to the outcome of this conflict. I wasn't fighting to stay. I was choosing how to leave. Late one night, Ruth called. "I may not have much time left," she said, her voice steady but tired. I felt my throat tighten. "Don't say that." "I'm not afraid," she replied. "I just want you to promise me something." "Anything," I said. "Don't give them clarity they haven't earned," she said. "Let consequences teach what explanation never did." I closed my eyes. "I promise." When I hung up, I felt the weight of that promise settle. This wasn't about winning. It was about not rescuing people from the outcomes of their choices. By the end of July, the board accepted the need for structural change. Interim leadership became permanent. The company announced a partial divestment to stabilize cash flow. My father's name was removed from the press release. That more than anything told me where the power had gone, and I still hadn't signed the buyout. The next chapter wouldn't be loud. It would be final, because the moment I decided to accept their offer wouldn't be the end of the story. It would be the point where the tables stopped turning and simply settled into a new order. August arrived with heat that clung to everything, including the unresolved tension that had followed me for months. The mediation was scheduled for the second week downtown, in a glass building designed to feel impartial. I arrived early, as usual. Denise sat beside me, calm, organized, unreadable. Across the table, my parents sat together. Ethan arrived late. Marissa didn't come. That absence mattered. The mediator, a former judge named Alan Brewer, laid out the ground rules. Speak one at a time. Stick to facts. No interruptions. Ethan broke the rules within the first 5 minutes. "She never wanted this responsibility," he said, gesturing toward me. "She just doesn't like losing control." I didn't respond. Alan raised a hand. "That's an interpretation. Let's focus on documented actions." My father leaned forward. "We built this company as a family. Natalie was always part of it, but not in the way she's describing now." Denise slid a folder across the table. "Here is the operational timeline correspondence and third-party verification contradicting that statement." Alan reviewed it quietly. For the next 2 hours, the narrative unraveled piece by piece. Not dramatically, methodically. Each claim met with documentation. Each minimization countered with evidence. Emails, contracts, vendor testimony, bank correspondence. No one raised their voice. That was the most unsettling part for them. At one point, Alan looked directly at my parents. "Why was Ms. Pierce excluded from the transition planning process?" My mother hesitated. "We thought it would be easier." "Easier." Alan nodded slowly. "Easier for whom?" No one answered. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it brief. "I'm not here to punish anyone," I said. "I'm here to end my exposure and correct the record. I won't remain connected to a structure that required my silence to function." Alan looked at me for a long moment. Understood. The mediation ended with a directive, not an agreement. Revised disclosures, independent valuation, and a deadline. For the first time, they were being told what would happen next, not deciding it. Afterward, Ethan cornered me in the hallway. "You're enjoying this," he said low and sharp. I met his eyes. "No. I'm finished with it," he scoffed. You think you're better than us now? I shook my head. I think I'm separate. That distinction seemed to confuse him more than anything else. The valuation came back at the end of August. It was higher than the buyout offer. Significantly. Denise didn't smile when she showed me. This changes the calculus. It changes theirs, I said. She nodded. They won't like it. They didn't. My father called that night voice tight. This number is unrealistic. It's independent, I replied. You're forcing our hand. No, I said calmly. You forced mine months ago. He fell silent. The competitor I'd spoken to earlier followed up that same week. Formal offer, leadership role, equity participation, no family entanglement, no inherited hierarchy. I didn't accept immediately. I wanted to see this through. September began with another escalation, quieter, but more revealing. Marissa reached out, not to me, to Denise. She wanted to talk. Off the record, Denise asked me, before responding, "Do you want to hear what she has to say?" I considered it, yes. We met in a small cafe near Denise's office. Marissa arrived alone, visibly tense. "I didn't know how bad it was," she said quickly. "Not at first." I didn't interrupt. "Ethan never told me how much you handled," she continued. "He framed it like you chose to step back." I looked at her. "And you believed him?" She nodded. "I wanted to." There it was. The truth people rarely admit. "They're blaming you now," she added. "For everything. For the audit, for the freeze, for the board turning." I took a sip of water. "I'm not responsible for their reactions." She swallowed. "I know. I didn't want you thinking I was part of it." "I don't," I said. "But I won't protect you from the consequences either." Her shoulders sagged. "Fair." A week later, Ruth passed away, quietly, in her sleep. The call came early in the morning. I didn't cry immediately. I sat on the edge of my bed phone, in my hand, feeling the weight of finality. At the funeral, the family gathered in a way that felt ceremonial rather than connected. People spoke in generalities. Legacy, love, strength. I thought about how much Ruth had seen, without intervening until it mattered. After the service, Denise pulled me aside. "The trust will be executed within days," she said. "The clause will trigger." I nodded. "I know." The clause did exactly what Ruth intended. Because the family dispute had materially affected the business, a portion of the estate, assets were redistributed into a neutral trust, bypassing direct family control. Not vindictive, just protective. My parents were stunned. Ethan was furious. I felt nothing but gratitude. The final buyout offer arrived 3 days later. Revised. Accurate. Clean. No non-disclosure clause. No language about goodwill. Just numbers and release. Denise looked at me across her desk. "This is it." I read it slowly. Every line. Every implication. Then I signed. The wire transfer hit my account the following morning. I didn't celebrate. I closed my laptop and went for a walk. The tables had turned, not with a crash, but with a quiet realignment. They no longer needed my silence. And I no longer needed their approval. What remained wasn't anger or triumph. It was space. And in that space, something new was already forming. The morning after the wire transfer cleared, I woke up earlier than usual. Not from excitement, from stillness. For months, my nervous system had been calibrated to anticipation. The next email, the next escalation, the next carefully worded move. Now there was nothing pending. No deadlines, no leverage left to manage. That quiet was unfamiliar. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, staring at my phone without touching it. No missed calls, no messages, no crisis disguised as concern. The separation was complete. At 10 a.m., Denise emailed, confirming the filings were complete. My liabilities were terminated. My name was removed from guarantees. The declaratory action was dismissed as resolved. Clean exit. Her final line read, "You're free." I closed my laptop and let that word settle. Free didn't feel like relief, the way movies promise. It felt like responsibility. like standing on open ground without a script. By noon, the first reaction arrived. Ethan called. I let it ring. He called again, then sent a text. We need to talk. I didn't respond. An hour later, my mother emailed. Please just let us understand why you did this. That sentence used to pull me apart. The implication that clarity was something I owed. That my choices were incomplete until they were digested by the people who had opposed them. I drafted a response, then I deleted it. Understanding wasn't required for boundaries to be valid. That afternoon, I met with the competitor who had extended the offer. Their headquarters overlooked the harbor, glass and steel, and movement. The CEO, a woman named Helen Morris, spoke plainly. We don't need you to clean up anyone's mess, she said. We need you to build. I appreciated that she didn't ask me to summarize my past. We discussed structure, authority, exit options. She didn't flinch when I asked about equity terms. She didn't frame confidence as aggression. At the end of the meeting, she said, take your time. We want someone who chooses this, not someone running from something. I smiled. I'm not running. That night, my parents showed up at my apartment. Together, I didn't invite them in immediately. I stood in the doorway, arms relaxed, posture neutral. We just want to talk, my father said. I know, I replied. I stepped aside. They sat on my couch, like guests, not owners. That difference was visible to all of us. My mother spoke first. This didn't have to be so final. Yes, I said gently. It did. My father frowned. You cut us out. I shook my head. You removed me long before I left. That's not fair, he said. I'm not here to negotiate fairness, I replied. I'm here to explain the outcome. They exchanged a glance. You wanted me quiet. I continued. Compliant. Available. You wanted my labor without my authority, my loyalty without my consent. My mother's eyes filled. We never meant to hurt you. I know, I said. You meant to preserve what was comfortable. Silence followed. What happens now, my father asked. I answered honestly. We stop pretending this is something it isn't. He leaned forward. Are you cutting us off? I considered the question carefully. I'm not cutting you off. I'm removing expectations. They didn't understand that distinction. Not fully. My mother reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. These were in Ruth's things, she said. She wanted you to have them. Inside were letters. Handwritten. Years old. I recognized my grandmother's script immediately. I didn't open them in front of my parents. Thank you, I said. They left shortly after. No hug, no apology, no reconciliation. Just an acknowledgement that something irreversible had occurred. After the door closed, I sat on the floor and opened the letters. Ruth wrote about patterns, about how women in our family learn to absorb, about how strength, when unrecognized, becomes invisible. One line stayed with me. You don't owe permanence to anyone who requires your erasure. I slept deeply that night. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects became visible. Pierce Industrial Supply announced a full restructuring, new leadership, partial divestment. Ethan's name was no longer attached to press releases. Marissa returned to consulting. My parents downsized quietly. No one blamed me publicly. Privately, I'm sure they did. I accepted Helen's offer in October. The work was challenging in a way that energized me. Decisions had consequences, but not emotional penalties. Authority came with accountability, not guilt. At my first board meeting, someone asked me how I handled conflict. I paused. I stopped mistaking endurance for virtue, I said. They nodded, writing it down like a lesson. One evening in November, I received a message from Ethan. Not angry, not defensive, just a sentence. I didn't know how much you were carrying. I see it now. I read it once, then archived it. Seeing something too late doesn't restore what was lost. Thanksgiving passed quietly. I spent it with friends, chosen family people who didn't track my contributions like debts. As winter approached, I felt something unfamiliar. Peace that wasn't fragile, The revenge, if that's what anyone wanted to call it, wasn't the money, or the power shift, or watching a system wobble without me. It was this: the ability to wake up without bracing, to move forward without asking permission, to exist without being managed. And for the first time, that felt like enough. December changed the texture of everything. Not the dramatic kind of change. No fireworks, no sweeping realizations. Just the steady understanding that I no longer lived inside other people's expectations. The holidays used to tighten something in my chest. This year, they passed like weather. At work, I was given real authority almost immediately. Not ceremonial, not symbolic. Decisions that mattered. Budgets, personnel, strategy. When I said no, it stayed no. When I said yes, it moved forward without second guessing. No one asked me to soften my tone or wait for someone else's comfort. That alone felt radical. One afternoon, Helen stopped by my office. "You don't hover," she said. "You build systems and trust people to use them." "I learned the cost of being indispensable," I replied. She smiled. "That's a lesson some people never learn." Outside of work, my life grew quieter. Not emptier, quieter. Fewer obligations disguised as love. Fewer conversations that required translation. I stopped explaining why I wasn't visiting, why I wasn't calling, why I wasn't fixing what wasn't mine to fix. The absence of justification felt like oxygen. My mother emailed once before Christmas. "We're decorating the house this weekend. It feels strange without you." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I replied with one sentence: "I hope it's peaceful." Nothing more. I wasn't withholding affection. I was withholding access. On Christmas morning, I woke late, made coffee, and opened Ruth's letters again. I read them slowly this time, letting the words settle. She wrote about inheritance, but not the kind measured in assets. She wrote about patterns passed down, unexamined. About daughters trained to accommodate, and sons trained to assume. About how silence becomes a language in families where power is uneven. I folded the letters carefully and placed them back in their envelope. That afternoon, Denise called. "I wanted to check in," she said. "This is usually the point where people crash." "I feel steady," I replied. She laughed softly. "That's how you know it's real." She paused. "Your parents' attorney closed their file. No further action." "Thank you," I said. After we hung up, I realized something quietly significant. No one needed anything from me anymore. That was new. January brought snow and a kind of emotional neutrality I'd never experienced before. Not numbness, stability. I started running again, early mornings, when the city was quiet, and my thoughts stayed where I put them. One morning, as I stretched outside my building, a neighbor asked if I was traveling for the holidays. "No," I said. "I stayed." She smiled. "Lucky you." I almost laughed. For years, staying would have felt like failure, like absence, like punishment. Now it felt like choice. Mid-January, Lily's name crossed my mind. My sister-in-law had stopped reaching out months earlier. I didn't miss the dynamic, but I wondered how she was doing. I didn't check. Curiosity doesn't always require action. At work, a junior director asked me how I handled family pressure when it conflicted with professional judgment. The question landed softly, but it landed. I stopped treating family approval as a prerequisite for self-respect, I said. She nodded slowly. I need to remember that. I didn't tell her the cost. Everyone pays it differently. The first real emotional tremor came unexpectedly. I received an invitation to Ethan and Marissa's holiday party. Digital, polite, no message attached. I didn't open it right away. I thought about what it represented. Not reconciliation, optics, a photo where absence would be noticed, a narrative repair attempt without repair. I declined without comment. 10 minutes later, my father called. "I saw you declined," he said. "Yes," I replied. There was a pause. People are asking questions. I smiled to myself. They always do. You could make this easier, he said. For whom I asked. He didn't answer. When the call ended, I didn't feel anger, just confirmation. People who prioritize appearances over accountability never stop asking you to make things easier. Late January, Helen invited me to dinner with a small group of senior leaders. Not a test, a welcome. At the table, someone joked about family businesses being impossible. I said nothing. Not every truth needs to be shared. On the way home, walking through cold air and city lights, I realized something else. I wasn't thinking about revenge anymore. The word had lost its pull. What I'd done wasn't about payback. It was about refusing to be absorbed by a system that fed on my compliance. It was about stepping out of a role I never agreed to play and letting the consequences redistribute themselves. February approached with no anniversaries, to dread no gatherings to navigate, no emotional negotiations waiting in the wings. Just my life unfolding without interference. The power shift everyone likes to dramatize didn't end with a confrontation or a speech. It ended with consistency, with me not showing up where I was expected to shrink, with me choosing not to return to rooms that required my silence as the price of admission. And in that steady refusal, something remarkable happened. The story moved on without me, and for the first time, that felt like freedom, not loss. February arrived quietly, the way truth often does, once it's no longer being resisted. There were no messages from my parents, no follow-ups, no attempts to soften what had already hardened. That absence wasn't accidental, it was adjustment. People learning where the edges now were and deciding whether they wanted to test them. I was fine either way. Work settled into a rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar in its lack of drama. Decisions were debated, not personalized. Disagreement didn't mean withdrawal of affection or status. If something failed, it was addressed directly. No triangulation, no silent punishment. One morning, Helen asked me to lead a new initiative. High stakes, public-facing. The kind of responsibility my family had once trusted me with privately, but never acknowledged publicly. "Are you comfortable with the visibility?" she asked. Yes, I said, and meant it. Visibility without erasure is different. It doesn't demand performance. It demands presence. Later that week, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. It was my father. I didn't answer immediately. I let it ring twice, long enough to remind myself that choice existed. Then I picked up. "We're selling the house," he said, without greeting. "The old one?" I asked. Yes, I pictured it instantly. The long dining table, the hallway where family photos still hung frozen in a version of us that no longer existed. "I wanted you to hear it from me," he added. "Thank you," I said. There was a pause. "Your mother is taking it hard." I waited. "She says the house doesn't feel like home anymore." I chose my words carefully. Homes change when the people inside them stop telling the truth. He didn't argue. "We're downsizing," he continued. "Out of state." "I hope it suits you," I replied. Another pause. "Are you happy?" he asked. It wasn't an accusation, not a plea, just a question that came too late to alter anything. "Yes," I said. "I am." He exhaled slowly. "I'm glad." When the call ended, I sat still for a moment, letting the interaction land. It didn't reopen anything. It didn't close anything either. It simply confirmed that we were now operating on separate tracks. That same week, Ethan emailed. No subject line. I didn't open it right away. When I did, the message was brief. "The sale's going through. I won't be involved anymore. I guess this is what accountability looks like." I read it once, then archived it. Acknowledgement without repair still isn't reconciliation. In March, Ruth's trust was finalized. The redistribution clause executed cleanly. No public fallout, no courtroom drama, just quiet enforcement of boundaries she'd put in place years ago, waiting for the right moment. I visited her grave one afternoon alone. The air was cool, the ground still damp from winter. "I kept my promise," I said quietly. I didn't expect an answer, but I felt something like alignment settle in my chest. At work, the initiative launched successfully. I was quoted in an industry article. My name appeared without explanation, without qualifiers, without footnotes, tying me back to anyone else. I forwarded the article to no one. Recognition only matters when it doesn't need witnesses. One evening, Denise invited me to dinner, not to discuss anything legal, just dinner. "You know," she said over dessert, "most people come to me trying to win." "I wasn't," I replied. "No," she agreed. "You were trying to exit intact." I smiled. "That's harder." "It is," she said, "and rarer." Spring crept in gradually. Longer days, softer mornings. I started opening my windows again, letting air move through rooms that had once felt like holding spaces. One Saturday, while sorting through old files, I came across a draft of the transition agreement I'd almost signed months earlier. The one that would have quietly erased everything I'd built. I read it now with distance. I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. That version of me would have signed it to keep peace, to avoid being labeled difficult, to preserve access that came at the cost of dignity. This version didn't need to prove anything. I shredded the document and threw it away. In April, a colleague asked me to speak at a small leadership retreat. The topic was boundaries in high-pressure environments. During the Q&A, a woman in her late 50s raised her hand. "What do you do when the people crossing your boundaries are family?" she asked. The room went quiet. I didn't rush my answer. "You stop explaining," I said, "and you start acting. People don't need to understand your boundaries to respect them. They just need to experience them." She nodded slowly, eyes shining. Afterward, she thanked me quietly. I needed to hear that. So did I once. Later that month, Lily sent a message. No subject, just words. She wrote about therapy, about unpacking patterns she hadn't questioned, about realizing how much of her identity had been built around keeping the peace. She ended with, "I'm sorry I stayed silent when it mattered." I read it carefully. Then I replied, "Thank you for saying that. I wish you well." Nothing more. I wasn't withholding forgiveness. I was withholding reintegration. There's a difference. By May, my life felt stable in a way I hadn't known before. Not perfect, not immune to pain, but no longer governed by other people's comfort. I'd stopped waiting for apologies, stopped needing closure conversations, stopped hoping for family to become something it had never been. That hope had been the last tether. And once it broke, nothing pulled me backward anymore. The story that began with exclusion was nearing its end. Not with reconciliation, but with ownership of my choices, my time, my future. The final chapter wouldn't be about them at all. It would be about what comes after survival, about what you build when no one is managing you anymore. And I was ready for that. The last thing I released wasn't anger. It was the habit of checking behind me. I realized it one morning in early June, standing in my kitchen with the windows open, the sound of the city drifting in without demand. I was thinking about an upcoming board presentation, not about who might disapprove, not about whether my success would make someone uncomfortable. The old reflex was gone. That absence felt like peace. For most of my life, I had lived with a quiet, backward glance, measuring my steps against expectations I never agreed to. Even after the legal battles ended, even after the money settled, and the roles were clarified, part of me still waited for the emotional follow-up, the apology that would make it all make sense, the conversation where everyone finally admitted what had happened. That conversation never came, and I didn't need it anymore. Work filled my days in a way that felt honest. I was building something new, not rescuing something broken. When decisions went wrong, we fixed them. When people disagreed, they spoke directly. No one punished silence because silence wasn't currency here. One afternoon, Helen stopped by my office, and leaned against the doorframe. "You're different from when you started," she said. I looked up. "How so?" "You don't over-explain anymore," she replied. "You decide." I smiled. That used to be called cold in my family. Now it was called leadership. In July, I took my first real vacation in years. No laptop, no contingency plans. I rented a small place near the water, walked every morning, read novels instead of contracts. I didn't feel the urge to document it for anyone. No proof required. One evening, watching the sun sink into the horizon, I thought about Christmas dinner, about the word selfish hanging in the air unanswered, about how that moment had cracked something open that could never be sealed again. Back then, I thought the pain came from being excluded. I was wrong. The pain came from realizing how conditional belonging had always been. I thought about my parents adjusting to a smaller life they hadn't chosen, but had earned through avoidance. I thought about Ethan learning what accountability feels like when there's no one left to shield him. I thought about Ruth, who had seen it all and waited until I was ready to stop explaining myself. None of it felt heavy anymore. That was the final victory. Not watching anyone fall, but no longer carrying what wasn't mine. In August, I received a holiday card from my parents. Neutral, polite, signed with both names. No invitation, no guilt, just acknowledgement. I placed it in a drawer and moved on. Lily sent an update a few weeks later. Therapy was helping. She was learning to sit with discomfort instead of smoothing it over. She didn't ask for anything. I wished her well and meant it. There was no reconciliation arc, no dramatic reunion, no tearful apology scene where everything reset. Real life doesn't work that way. What happened instead was quieter and more permanent. I stopped centering my life around people who only valued me when I complied. I stopped mistaking endurance for love. I stopped negotiating my place in rooms where my silence was expected. The revenge, if someone insists on calling it that, wasn't the money or the power shift or the legal outcome. It was choosing myself without explanation. It was signing papers without apology. It was leaving tables where I was only welcome if I stayed small. It was understanding that family drama doesn't end when people change, but when you do. By the time fall arrived, my life felt aligned. Not perfect, not immune to grief, but grounded. I knew where I stood because I had chosen the ground. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own story, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't need permission to protect yourself. You don't need consensus to draw a boundary. You don't need to stay loyal to systems that require your erasure. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to confront. It's to exit cleanly, with your dignity intact, and build a life where your value isn't debated. If this story resonated with you, take a moment, like it, share it. Leave a comment if you want to tell your own story. And if you're not ready to speak yet, that's okay too. Just don't confuse silence with peace. Choose yourself. That choice changes everything.